Right now, there are over 8 billion humans on this planet. We've built cities that touch the clouds, split the atom, landed robots on Mars, connected every corner of Earth with invisible networks of information. We are everywhere. We dominate. We've conquered this world so completely that it's almost impossible to imagine it any other way. But here's something that will mess with your head. For the first 200,000 years of our existence as a species, we almost didn't matter at all. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, people with brains identical to yours, lived for 200,000 years doing basically nothing that would change the world. We were just another animal trying to survive in Africa. Smart, sure, but not special, not dominant, not destined for anything. And then, 50,000 years ago, something happened, something clicked, something changed in a way that can't be explained by biology alone, because our brains hadn't gotten bigger, our bodies hadn't evolved. Physically, we were the same species we'd been for 200,000 years, but suddenly we weren't acting like it. Suddenly, humans started creating art, making jewelry, building sophisticated tools, developing complex languages, forming trade networks that spanned hundreds of miles. Suddenly, we started acting like us. Scientists call it the Great Leap Forward, the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, the moment when behavioral modernity emerged. But nobody really knows what caused it. Nobody can explain why humans who had existed for 200,000 years suddenly exploded into consciousness and creativity all at once. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Sydney at sunrise, Seattle at sunset, all at once. This is the story of what really happened. The entire 250,000-year journey of our species, from the first Homo sapiens in Africa to the moment everything changed. And when you see the full picture, when you understand what came before that mysterious transformation 50,000 years ago, you start to realize it might not have been so sudden after all. The story starts around 300,000 years ago in Africa, not everywhere in Africa, just a few specific regions. Fossil evidence suggests the first Homo sapiens appeared in what's now Morocco and Ethiopia, emerging from earlier human species like Homo heidelbergensis through a process that probably took tens of thousands of years. These earliest humans looked almost like us. If you dressed one in modern clothes and put them on a subway, you might not notice anything unusual at first glance. They had high foreheads, small faces, prominent chins. Their brains were the same size as ours, sometimes even larger, but they weren't living like modern humans, not even close. They were making stone tools, yes, but tools that their ancestors had been making for hundreds of thousands of years. Simple hand axes, basic scrapers, nothing innovative. They were hunting and gathering, living in small groups, surviving day to day in the African wilderness. For context, this is the same time period when Neanderthals were thriving in Europe and Asia, when Denisovans were spreading across the eastern part of the world, when multiple human species existed simultaneously, each adapted to their own environments, none of them clearly superior to the others. Early Homo sapiens were just one player in a crowded field, and for a very long time they weren't even the most successful player. Neanderthals had bigger brains, stronger bodies, better cold weather adaptations. They seemed more likely to inherit the Earth than we did. So what made Homo sapiens different? At first, honestly, not much. The biological package was there. The brain capacity, the vocal anatomy for complex speech, the manual dexterity for fine tool work. But having the hardware doesn't mean you're using it. A computer can have the most powerful processor in the world, but if you're only running basic programs, what's the point? For 200,000 years, humans had the capacity for behavioral modernity but weren't expressing it. Or at least the archaeological record suggests they weren't. No art, no jewelry, no symbolic behavior, no evidence of the kind of abstract thinking that defines modern human culture, just survival, day after day, generation after generation, for thousands upon thousands of years, living, reproducing, dying, leaving almost no trace beyond some bones and stone tools that look identical to what their great-great-great-grandparents made 10,000 years earlier. This is what anthropologists call the paradox of behavioral modernity. Anatomically, modern humans existed for 200,000 years before they started acting modern. Why? What took so long? What was missing? Some scientists thought maybe those early humans actually weren't fully modern. Maybe their brains, despite being the same size, weren't quite wired the same way. Maybe some crucial neural change happened later that the fossil record can't capture. But genetic evidence has basically killed that theory. Modern humans haven't undergone any significant biological changes in the last 200,000 years. The San people of southern Africa, whose ancestors split off from other human populations very early, are just as intelligent and creative as anyone else. Biology can't explain the delay. So if it wasn't biology, what was it? To answer that, we need to understand what life was actually like for these early humans. What were they doing during those long millennia of apparent stagnation? They were surviving. Barely. Africa during this period was not a paradise. Climate records show the continent went through repeated cycles of extreme drought and occasional flooding. The Sahara Desert expanded and contracted. Lake levels rose and fell. Entire ecosystems appeared and disappeared within a few generations. Early Homo sapiens populations were small and scattered. Genetic analysis suggests there were probably never more than a few tens of thousands of individuals alive at any one time during the first 100,000 years. Compare that to Neanderthals, who numbered in the hundreds of thousands across Europe and Asia. These small human populations were constantly on the edge. When droughts hit, groups would fracture, searching for water and food in different directions. When resources were abundant, populations would grow, only to crash again when conditions worsened. This kind of instability makes cultural accumulation nearly impossible. Imagine trying to develop sophisticated technologies when your group's survival is never guaranteed beyond the next dry season, when the priority is always immediate survival, not innovation, when every drought might wipe out the people who know how to make the best tools or find the most reliable food sources. Knowledge was being lost as fast as it was gained. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 2 steps back. Human groups would develop clever survival techniques, then climate disasters would kill off the people who knew them. The next generation would have to start over, relearning basics that their grandparents had mastered. This is what anthropologists call cultural regression. It happens when populations get too small to maintain complex knowledge systems, and it probably happened to early Homo sapiens over and over again, but they persisted. Somehow, despite the climate chaos and the constant threat of extinction, human populations kept hanging on. Groups that got too small would either recover or be replaced by migrants from other regions. The network as a whole survived even when individual populations didn't. And during this time, even though they weren't creating art or jewelry or sophisticated technology, these early humans were learning. They were becoming master survivalists. They were developing the skills that would eventually let them not just survive in Africa, but conquer the entire planet. They learned to track animals across vast distances, reading signs invisible to other predators. They learned to identify hundreds of plant species, knowing which were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They learned to predict weather patterns, to find water in seemingly dry landscapes, to survive in environments that would kill most other large mammals. Most importantly, they learned to cooperate. Because in small populations facing constant environmental stress, cooperation wasn't optional. It was the only way anyone survived. You shared food during good times, so others would share with you during bad times. You helped raise children that weren't your own, because someday you'd need others to help raise yours. You taught what you knew, because if you died before passing on that knowledge, everyone suffered. Over thousands of generations, this created something unprecedented in the animal kingdom. A species where information flow between individuals became almost as important as genetic inheritance. Where what you learned mattered as much as what you were born with. Where culture, primitive as it was, started becoming a survival tool in its own right. The fossil sites from this early period tell us a lot about how these humans lived, even if they don't show much cultural sophistication. Take Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, where some of the earliest Homo sapiens fossils were found. The site dates to about 315,000 years ago, and it shows humans who were already using fire systematically, hunting medium-sized game, and making stone tools with techniques that required teaching and practice. But here's what's interesting. The stone tools at Jebel Irhoud are part of what archaeologists call the Middle Stone Age technology. These are more advanced than the really ancient Oldowan tools from millions of years ago, but they're not dramatically different from what Homo heidelbergensis had been making for hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens even existed. In other words, the earliest humans weren't innovating. They inherited a toolkit from their ancestors and stuck with it. For tens of thousands of years, the tools barely changed. Same shapes, same production techniques, same functions. This pattern repeats at site after site across Africa. Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, dated to about 195,000 years ago, shows anatomically modern humans with Middle Stone Age tools. Herto in Ethiopia, dated to 160,000 years ago, same story. These people had modern brains, but they were using ancient technology. Why? Population size is probably the answer. Mathematical models show that cultural innovation requires not just smart individuals, but large enough populations to sustain specialists. When your group only has 30 or 40 people, everyone needs to focus on survival tasks. There's no room for someone to spend years perfecting a new tool-making technique when those years could be spent hunting or gathering food. And when populations are scattered and isolated, innovations that do occur in one group might never spread to others. That clever new spear design someone invented, it dies with them or their small family group if they don't encounter other humans to teach it to. But even in these early, apparently stagnant times, something important was developing. Social complexity, the ability to maintain relationships, to cooperate in groups, to share information effectively. These skills don't fossilize. They don't leave clear archaeological signatures, but they were being refined through natural selection every single generation. Think about it this way. You're living 250,000 years ago in a group of 30 people. This isn't just your family. This is everyone you will ever interact with for months at a time, maybe years. If you can't get along with these people, your life becomes miserable. If you actively antagonize them, you might get excluded from the group, which in the African wilderness basically means death. So there's intense selection pressure for social skills. Reading other people's emotions, predicting their behavior, knowing when to be generous and when to ask for help. Understanding the complex web of relationships and obligations that holds the group together. Individuals who were good at this, who could navigate social situations skillfully, had better access to resources, better mating opportunities, better chances of their children surviving. Over thousands of generations, this created humans who were incredibly socially intelligent. And this social intelligence required communication, not just grunts and gestures, but increasingly sophisticated vocalizations that could convey complex information about social relationships, about resources, about plans and intentions. Nobody knows exactly when language evolved to its modern form. The anatomy required for speech was in place early. Neanderthals had it too. But having the physical capability to make complex sounds doesn't mean you're using them for complex language. The most likely scenario is that language evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, becoming more complex and sophisticated as the social and survival benefits of better communication increased. By 200,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens probably had language that was more advanced than any modern ape, but less complex than modern human languages. They could probably communicate concrete information pretty well. Where the good hunting is, which plants are safe to eat, warnings about predators, basic social information about who's related to whom and who owes favors to whom. But abstract concepts, planning far into the future, telling stories about things that happened long ago or might happen someday, that probably came later. That required not just the cognitive capacity for abstract thought, but the cultural systems to make abstract communication useful and reliable. By 150,000 years ago, humans were showing the first glimmers of behavioral modernity. Archaeological sites from this period contain ochre, a red mineral pigment that had to be collected from specific locations and brought back to living sites. Nobody knows exactly what they used it for. Body paint, hide processing, ritual purposes. What matters is that they were using it at all. Ochre serves no obvious survival function. You can't eat it. It doesn't make better tools. It doesn't keep you warm. The fact that humans were bothering to collect and use it suggests they were thinking about things beyond immediate survival. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, archaeologists found a site dated to about 164,000 years ago, where humans were systematically collecting ochre and bringing it to their cave shelter. They found over 8,000 pieces of ochre at this one site. Some pieces show signs of being ground down, as if they were making powder. This is significant because it suggests planning and intention. Someone had to go to where the ochre was, recognize it as valuable, carry it back to camp, and then process it for whatever purpose they had in mind. That's multiple steps removed from immediate survival needs. The same site shows something else interesting. Humans were eating shellfish. The cave is on the coast, and the archaeological layers contain thousands of shells from mussels and other marine species. This matters because exploiting marine resources requires specialized knowledge. You need to know tide schedules. You need to understand which shellfish are safe to eat and which are toxic. You need tools to pry them off rocks or dig them out of sand. You need to know how to process and cook them. This is complex, learned behavior that has to be passed from one generation to the next. And here's the thing about coastal resources. They're reliable. The ocean doesn't have droughts. Shellfish populations are stable compared to terrestrial animals. If humans were learning to exploit marine resources 164,000 years ago, they were developing a stable food supply that could support larger populations. Larger populations mean less chance of cultural knowledge being lost. More individuals mean more chances for innovations to occur and spread. More stable food supplies mean more time for activities beyond pure survival. This is what anthropologists call the coastal refuge hypothesis. The idea that during periods of extreme climate stress inland, human populations survived along the coasts where marine resources provided a buffer against environmental disasters. Genetic evidence supports this. Mitochondrial DNA analysis shows that some of the oldest lineages of modern humans are found in coastal populations in southern Africa. These people's ancestors may have been living along the coast continuously for over 100,000 years. But even with coastal resources and ochre use, these early humans still weren't showing the full package of behavioural modernity. The tools remained traditional. There's no clear evidence of art or jewellery. No signs of ritual burials or other symbolic behaviour beyond the possible use of ochre. They were on the cusp. The pieces were assembling, but something was still holding them back. Then came the crisis that almost ended everything. Around 135,000 years ago, Earth's climate entered one of the most severe glacial periods in recent history. This wasn't the worst climate crisis humans would face that had happened 900,000 years earlier and nearly wiped out all human ancestors. But it was bad enough. Ice sheets expanded across the northern continents. Sea levels dropped by over 300 feet as water got locked up in glaciers. And Africa, where all humans still lived, became drastically drier. The Sahara expanded. Lakes dried up. Rivers that had flowed year-round became seasonal or disappeared entirely. Genetic analysis shows human populations crashed during this period. The evidence comes from something called effective population size, calculated by looking at genetic diversity in modern populations and working backward. The math suggests humans might have been reduced to as few as 10,000 individuals scattered across the entire continent. For context, that's less than the capacity of a small sports stadium, all of humanity fitting into a single arena, spread across millions of square miles of increasingly hostile territory. For tens of thousands of years, from about 135,000 to 90,000 years ago, humans teetered on the edge of extinction. Most populations died out entirely. The archaeological record from this period is almost empty. There are hardly any sites, hardly any remains. For a while, archaeologists called this the fossil gap and couldn't explain it. Now we know. There simply weren't many humans around to leave fossils behind. With only 10,000 individuals in the entire species scattered in small groups across a continent, the chances of any of them dying in conditions that would preserve their bones for over 100,000 years were incredibly small. But the few survivors weren't just hanging on through luck. They were the ones who had the best survival skills, the strongest social bonds, the most effective cooperation strategies. This period acted as a brutal filter, selecting for exactly the traits that would later enable behavioural modernity. The groups that survived were probably concentrated in a few refugees where conditions remained tolerable. The southern coast of Africa is the most likely candidate. Evidence from coastal cave sites shows continuous human occupation through this period, while inland sites go silent. These coastal populations survived by exploiting marine resources, maintaining the knowledge systems their ancestors had developed, passing survival skills from one generation to the next with obsessive care because losing that knowledge meant death. And during this crisis, something was changing in how humans thought and communicated. We can't see it directly in the archaeological record, but we can infer it from what happened afterward. When the climate finally improved around 90,000 years ago, the humans who emerged from the crisis were different. Not biologically, their genes hadn't changed significantly, but culturally, socially, cognitively, they were more sophisticated than their ancestors. The crisis had forced them to develop more efficient ways of sharing knowledge, more complex social networks to maintain connections between scattered groups, more sophisticated communication to coordinate activities and share crucial survival information. Natural selection during the crisis had favored individuals who could learn quickly, teach effectively, and cooperate extensively. For 45,000 years, thousands of generations, these traits were being refined under the most intense survival pressure imaginable. Archaeological sites from just after 90,000 years ago show the first real signs of change. More ochre use, not just at one or two sites, but across multiple regions. The first definite instances of shell beads found at Blombos Cave in South Africa dated to about 75,000 years ago. These beads are important. They're made from small shells that had to be collected, then perforated using stone tools. Some show signs of wear, suggesting they were strung together and worn, maybe as necklaces or bracelets. This is clear evidence of personal ornamentation, of humans caring about their appearance, of symbolic behavior that serves no survival function. At the same site, archaeologists found engraved pieces of ochre with geometric patterns, deliberate designs, clearly intentional, serving no practical purpose. These are the earliest known examples of abstract art, not pictures of animals or people, just patterns. Lines and cross-hatching that someone thought were worth the effort to create. This is huge. Making marks on a rock because you think the pattern means something or looks good, that's a fundamentally different cognitive process than making a tool because you need to cut meat. It's evidence of minds capable of abstract thought, of symbolic representation, of seeing meaning beyond immediate physical reality. Why 75,000 years ago? Why did symbolic behavior emerge in a clear, undeniable form at this particular time? The timing points to the crisis as a catalyst. The humans who survived 135,000 to 90,000 years ago had been forced to develop more sophisticated cognitive and social systems. Their descendants, living in a slowly recovering environment with growing populations, were now expressing those capabilities in visible ways. But they still hadn't exploded into full behavioral modernity. The changes were significant but localized. Most of Africa still shows traditional Middle Stone Age technology. The innovations at places like Blombos were remarkable, but not yet representative of the species as a whole. Then came Toba. 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano in what's now Indonesia erupted in one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years. It ejected over 800 cubic miles of ash and rock into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption ejected about 1 cubic mile of material. Toba was 800 times larger. The eruption created a volcanic winter. Sulfur dioxide from the eruption formed a haze in the upper atmosphere that blocked sunlight for years. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in some regions. Growing seasons shortened dramatically. Plant growth crashed. Animal populations that depended on plants crashed. Predators that depended on those animals crashed. It was an ecological catastrophe on a global scale, and humans, with their small population still recovering from the previous climate crisis, were hit hard. For a while, scientists believed Toba created an extreme genetic bottleneck that reduced humans to just 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. More recent genetic analysis suggests the bottleneck wasn't quite that severe, but humans definitely suffered. Populations that had been slowly growing crashed again. Groups that had been expanding into new territories retreated back to core refugees. But here's what's fascinating. The archaeological record after Toba shows humans developing new survival strategies at an unprecedented rate. The period from 70,000 to 60,000 years ago sees more innovation than the previous 100,000 years combined. New stone tool technologies appear suddenly. Blade production becomes widespread, a technique that produces long, sharp cutting edges from small amounts of stone. This is much more efficient than earlier methods. A single fist-sized stone core could be turned into tools with 30 or 40 feet of cutting edge using blade technology, compared to maybe 10 feet using older techniques. Composite tools start showing up. These are weapons or implements made from multiple materials combined together. A stone point hafted to a wooden shaft with plant resin or animal sinew to make a spear. A row of sharp stone blades embedded in a wooden handle to make a knife. This requires planning, multiple steps, different materials collected from different locations. Bone tools become common for the first time. Awls for piercing leather, points for spears, even needles, though those come a bit later. Bone requires different working techniques than stone. You have to know how to shape it, how to polish it, how to keep it from cracking. All of this innovation in just a few thousand years. What changed? The Toba catastrophe probably acted as another evolutionary accelerator, like the earlier crisis 135,000 years ago. When survival is extremely difficult, the groups with the best cognitive tools, the most efficient communication, the strongest cooperation have enormous advantages. But unlike earlier crises, this time human populations were larger and more connected. Innovations that occurred in one group could spread to others through trade networks and migrations. Knowledge wasn't being lost every time a small group died out. The cultural foundation was finally stable enough to maintain innovation through even major disasters. By 70,000 years ago, something else was happening. Human populations were becoming more structured, more organized. Archaeological sites show evidence of specialized activity areas, places where stone tools were made separate from places where food was processed. This suggests division of labor, people focusing on specific tasks rather than everyone doing everything. Burial sites become more common and more elaborate, not just bodies hastily covered with dirt, but deliberate graves with bodies arranged in specific positions, sometimes with grave goods, a person buried with tools or ornaments or offerings of food. This indicates belief systems extending beyond the physical world, concepts of death and perhaps an afterlife. The tools themselves start showing regional variation. Humans in different parts of Africa were developing their own styles, their own techniques. This is the signature of cultural traditions, of groups maintaining specific ways of doing things and passing those traditions to their children. All of this is setting the stage for what comes next. The pieces of behavioral modernity are assembling. Large enough populations to sustain innovation, complex enough social structures to maintain knowledge systems, sophisticated enough communication to share abstract concepts, reliable enough cultural transmission to pass innovations from one generation to the next. Around 65,000 years ago, a small group of humans left Africa. This wasn't the first attempt. Humans had tried to expand beyond Africa before. Around 180,000 years ago, some groups reached the Middle East, but those populations died out or retreated back to Africa within a few thousand years. Around 90,000 years ago, another group tried and failed, but this time was different. This time, the migrants had something their predecessors lacked. They had the full suite of cognitive and cultural tools that would eventually be called behavioral modernity. The route was probably across the southern end of the Red Sea, maybe during a period of low sea level when the crossing was easier. Just a few hundred individuals at most, possibly as few as 1 or 2 extended families. But they carried with them everything humans had learned during their 250,000-year existence, and they carried something else too. genetic evidence shows these migrants interbred with a mysterious population, possibly remnant Homo heidelbergensis, or an unknown human species somewhere in the Middle East or Arabian Peninsula. We don't know much about this population, but the mixing added genetic diversity that may have helped the migrants adapt to new environments. From the Middle East, these humans moved fast. Within a few thousand years, they had spread across southern Asia, following the coastlines, exploiting marine resources, just like their ancestors had done in Africa. By 50,000 years ago, they had reached Australia. Think about that for a second. Reaching Australia meant crossing open ocean. The shortest route still required traveling over 50 miles of open water, probably more. These humans had to build boats capable of surviving ocean voyages. They had to navigate without maps or compasses. They had to bring enough food and water for a journey that might take days. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't just drifting on logs and getting lucky. This was planned, deliberate maritime technology that required sophisticated knowledge of boat building, weather patterns, navigation by stars or currents. The humans who reached Australia 50,000 years ago were already behaviourally modern in every sense. They just hadn't exploded into the full artistic and technological expression that would soon define the species. Meanwhile, other groups were moving north from the Middle East into Europe and Central Asia. And this is where they encountered their long-lost cousins, the Neanderthals, descendants of earlier human migrations that had left Africa hundreds of thousands of years earlier, now perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe. The meeting between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals is one of the most important events in human history. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, two distinct human species were competing for the same territories and resources. At first, neither had a clear advantage. Neanderthals were stronger, more cold-adapted, had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, and knew the landscape intimately. Modern humans were more numerous, more technologically innovative, better at long-range planning and cooperation. And they interbred. Not extensively, but it happened. Genetic analysis of modern non-African populations shows that everyone outside of Africa carries about 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's the signature of those encounters between the species 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. But interbreeding implies something important. It means these two species saw each other as potential mates, as similar enough to form relationships with. They weren't completely different species like lions and tigers. They were more like different populations that had been separated long enough to develop distinct characteristics, but could still recognize each other as human. The same thing happened in Asia, where modern humans encountered the Denisovans. Again, there was interbreeding. Modern Asian and Pacific Islander populations carry Denisovan DNA. Some Pacific Islanders have as much as 6% Denisovan ancestry. These meetings with other human species may have contributed to the final crystallization of behavioral modernity. Encountering other humans who looked different, who had different technologies, who spoke different languages, this would have forced modern humans to develop more sophisticated ways of communicating and cooperating. You can't rely on shared cultural knowledge when you meet someone from a completely different population. You need more explicit communication. You need ways of establishing trust and cooperation with strangers. You need to be able to negotiate, to trade, to form alliances. All of this would have accelerated the development of complex language and social systems. And once you have complex language, once you can communicate abstract ideas reliably, everything else becomes possible. By 50,000 years ago, all the pieces were in place. Large growing populations spread across Africa, Asia, and Australia. complex social structures capable of maintaining cooperation in groups of hundreds or thousands, sophisticated stone tool technologies that were constantly evolving, early maritime capabilities, abstract symbolic thinking evidenced by art and ornamentation. And then came the explosion, the Great Leap Forward, the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Call it whatever you want, but around 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record undergoes a transformation so dramatic it's visible everywhere humans lived. Suddenly, art is everywhere, not just simple patterns scratched on ochre, but sophisticated cave paintings. The famous Lascaux and Chauvet caves in France, with their stunning animal paintings, date to around 30,000 years ago. But evidence of figurative art starts appearing around 40,000 to 45,000 years ago across Europe and Asia. These aren't crude stick figures. These are detailed naturalistic representations of animals showing understanding of anatomy, movement, perspective. Some paintings use the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. Some show animals in motion, running or leaping. The level of skill implies these weren't the first attempts at painting. There must have been a tradition, a cultural practice of creating art that had been developing for thousands of years before the surviving examples were created. Sculpture appears at the same time, carved figurines of animals and humans, some astonishingly detailed. The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel, a 12-inch tall sculpture of a human figure with a lion's head, dates to about 40,000 years ago. This isn't just art, this is mythological thinking, the ability to imagine beings that don't exist in nature. Musical instruments show up in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago, bone flutes with multiple holes capable of playing complex melodies. These aren't simple whistles, these are precision instruments that require understanding of acoustics and musical theory to design and create. The tool technology explodes in diversity. Hundreds of distinct tool types appear across different regions. Specialized implements for specific purposes. Microliths, tiny stone blades that could be hafted in rows to create sharp saws or arrows. Barbed harpoons for fishing. Atlatls, spear throwers that could launch projectiles with lethal force from 50 meters or more. Sewing needles appear, made from bone or ivory, with eyes for threading sinew or plant fiber. This implies fitted clothing, garments tailored to the body rather than just animal skins draped over shoulders. Fitted clothing is much more effective for cold weather survival, which helped humans expand into northern regions. Evidence of long-distance trade networks becomes clear, raw materials showing up hundreds or thousands of miles from their source. Seashells from the Mediterranean found at sites in Central Europe. Obsidian from volcanic sources moved across vast distances. Amber from the Baltic region traded southward. This trade implies complex social networks, relationships maintained across enormous territories. It implies economic thinking, the concept of value and exchange. It implies trust between groups who might only meet occasionally. Burial practices become more elaborate and more standardized. Bodies arranged in specific positions, often with rich grave goods. Some burials show clear evidence of social status. Leaders or important individuals buried with elaborate ornaments, weapons, or tools. This is evidence of social hierarchies, of societies complex enough to have recognized roles and ranks, and the population explodes. By 40,000 years ago, there were probably several 100,000 modern humans spread across the old world. By 30,000 years ago, over 1 million. By 20,000 years ago, several million. The species that had once numbered in the tens of thousands was growing exponentially. All of this happening simultaneously across vast regions, not just in one place, spreading slowly outward, but everywhere humans lived. this explosion of cultural complexity and technological innovation was occurring. This is what scientists found so baffling. How could such a dramatic transformation happen simultaneously across populations that were separated by thousands of miles? What could cause such a sudden, universal shift in human behavior? The answer is, it wasn't sudden at all. It was the culmination of 250,000 years of development finally reaching critical mass. Think of it like water approaching the boiling point. For a long time, the temperature rises gradually with no obvious change in the water's behavior. 90 degrees, still liquid. 95 degrees, still liquid. 99 degrees, still liquid. Then you hit 100 degrees and suddenly everything changes. The water transforms from liquid to gas in an instant. But that transformation wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable result of all the gradual heating that came before. That's what happened to human culture around 50,000 years ago. The foundation had been building for hundreds of thousands of years. Social complexity gradually increasing, communication systems gradually becoming more sophisticated, tool technologies gradually improving, knowledge transmission gradually becoming more reliable. Each of these developments was slow, incremental, barely visible in the archaeological record, but they were all happening simultaneously, all feeding into each other. Better communication enabled more complex social structures. More complex social structures enabled larger populations. Larger populations enabled more specialization and innovation. More innovation enabled better survival. Better survival enabled population growth, a positive feedback loop that had been accelerating slowly for millennia. By 70,000 years ago, it was approaching the tipping point. By 60,000 years ago, with humans spreading into new territories and encountering new challenges and opportunities, the feedback loop was accelerating faster. By 50,000 years ago, it hit critical mass and exploded. The Great Leap Forward wasn't a leap. It was a phase transition, like water boiling, like a snowball rolling down a hill, gathering more snow until it becomes an avalanche. All the pieces had been assembling for hundreds of thousands of years, but they needed to reach a certain threshold before the full potential could be expressed. What was that threshold? Probably a combination of factors all coming together at once. Population size large enough to sustain cumulative culture without losing innovations when small groups died out. Social networks complex enough to share innovations across vast distances. Language sophisticated enough to transmit abstract concepts and complex procedures. Tool technology advanced enough to enable further innovation. Symbolic thinking developed enough to create shared myths and beliefs that could bind large groups together. Once all of these elements reached a certain level, they reinforced each other in an accelerating cycle. Each improvement in one area enabled improvements in others. The process became self-sustaining and rapidly accelerating, and once it started, there was no stopping it. Within just 10,000 years, humans had spread to every habitable continent except Antarctica. They had developed technologies that allowed them to survive in environments from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra. They had created art and music and mythology so sophisticated that it still resonates with us today, 40,000 years later. They had also begun to reshape the planet itself. Everywhere humans spread, large animals started going extinct. The woolly mammoth, the giant sloth, the saber-toothed cat, dozens of species of megafauna that had survived for millions of years disappeared within a few thousand years of humans arriving in their territories. This wasn't just climate change. This was humans becoming such effective predators that they could hunt the largest animals on Earth to extinction. The combination of sophisticated hunting weapons, coordinated group tactics, and the ability to track and predict animal behavior made humans the most dangerous predators the planet had ever seen. The Neanderthals discovered this the hard way. For tens of thousands of years after modern humans arrived in Europe, the two species coexisted, sometimes peacefully, trading and interbreeding, sometimes competing for the same resources. But increasingly, the Neanderthals found themselves losing ground. It wasn't that modern humans were stronger or smarter in any simple sense. Neanderthal brains were actually larger on average. They were physically more robust, better adapted to cold climates. They had survived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years through multiple ice ages. But modern humans had behavioral modernity. They had the full package of cultural tools that made them incredibly adaptable. When Neanderthals encountered a new problem, they solved it through individual skill and knowledge accumulated over generations. When modern humans encountered a new problem, they could draw on collective knowledge from dozens or hundreds of people, combine different techniques, innovate rapidly, and spread solutions across their entire population within years. Neanderthals made excellent stone tools using techniques refined over hundreds of thousands of years. Modern humans made those same tools, but they also made bone tools, antler tools, ivory tools. They made specialized implements for dozens of different purposes, and when one design didn't work, they tried another. Neanderthals were skilled hunters who took down large game through strength and determination. Modern humans hunted the same game with atlatls that gave them 3 times the range and twice the impact force. They developed nets and traps. They used fire to drive animals into kill zones. They had dogs, the first domesticated animals, to help track and corner prey. Most importantly, modern humans could cooperate in larger groups. Neanderthal social groups probably maxed out at 30 or 40 individuals. Modern humans could coordinate hunting parties of dozens, maintain trade relationships with hundreds of people, mobilize coalitions of multiple groups when resources were contested. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were being pushed into marginal territories, the best hunting grounds, the most reliable water sources, the prime cave sites with southern exposure and protection from wind. Modern humans controlled them all. Neanderthals retreated to mountains, northern forests, regions modern humans hadn't fully colonized yet. Their population dwindled. By 30,000 years ago, there were probably only a few thousand Neanderthals left, scattered in isolated pockets across southern Europe. By 28,000 years ago, the last populations in Gibraltar and southern Spain had disappeared. The same pattern played out with the Denisovans in Asia, though we know less about the details. By 30,000 years ago, modern humans were the only human species left on Earth. The three-way split that had begun when their common ancestors emerged from the ancient bottleneck 900,000 years earlier was over. Homo sapiens had won. But it wasn't really a victory through conflict. It was victory through efficiency. Modern humans could simply support larger populations in the same territories. They could bounce back faster from disasters. They could adapt more quickly to changing conditions. Over thousands of years, those advantages compounded until there was no room left for other human species. And modern humans kept innovating. By 30,000 years ago, they had spread into Siberia, surviving in some of the harshest climates on Earth. By 25,000 years ago, they had crossed into the Americas, probably following the Pacific coast and later moving inland through ice-free corridors. Everywhere they went, they adapted. In the Arctic, they developed sophisticated cold weather gear, multi-layered clothing, insulated boots, snow goggles to prevent snow blindness. They built semi-permanent dwellings from mammoth bones and hides when wood was scarce. They learned to hunt seals through ice holes and whales from boats. In deserts, they developed techniques for finding underground water, for surviving on minimal liquid intake, for processing plants that were inedible without elaborate preparation. They tracked the seasonal patterns of desert animals and plants, moving between resource patches with timing refined over generations. In rainforests, they learned to hunt in dense vegetation, to navigate without visible landmarks, to identify the hundreds of plant species that were edible, medicinal, or useful for materials. They developed blowguns for hunting small arboreal animals, elaborate fish traps for rivers and streams. Each environment required different knowledge, different tools, different strategies, but the underlying capability was the same: behavioral modernity, the ability to observe, learn, innovate, and transmit knowledge to the next generation, the ability to cooperate in groups large enough to tackle problems no individual could solve, the ability to plan for the future and learn from the past. By 20,000 years ago, humans numbered in the millions, spread across every continent except Antarctica. They spoke hundreds of distinct languages, each evolved from the proto-languages their ancestors had developed in Africa. They created thousands of distinct cultures, each with their own traditions, beliefs, technologies, and social structures. But they were all recognizably the same species. All descended from those same anatomically modern humans who had first appeared in Africa 300,000 years earlier. All carrying the genetic legacy of the crises their ancestors had survived, all expressing the behavioral modernity that had taken 250,000 years to fully develop. And then came the next revolution. Around 12,000 years ago, after the last ice age ended and the climate stabilized, humans in multiple regions independently invented agriculture. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys in China, the highlands of New Guinea, Mesoamerica, the Andes, West Africa. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the logical next step for a species with behavioral modernity. Humans had spent tens of thousands of years learning to manipulate their environment, to control fire, to modify plants and animals through selective harvesting. Agriculture was just taking those skills to the next level. With agriculture came population growth on a scale never before seen. Farming can support 50 to 100 times more people per square mile than hunting and gathering. Within just a few thousand years, human populations that had taken 200,000 years to reach a few million exploded to tens of millions. With larger populations came specialization. Not everyone needed to spend their time producing food. Some people could focus entirely on making tools, others on building structures, others on creating art or developing new technologies or maintaining religious and social institutions. With specialization came cities. By 5,000 years ago, the first urban centers appeared. Uruk in Mesopotamia, with tens of thousands of inhabitants. Memphis in Egypt, Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley. These weren't just big villages. These were complex societies with social hierarchies, division of labor, organized governments, professional armies. Writing appeared, independently invented in multiple regions to keep track of trade, taxes, and administrative information. Writing changed everything. For the first time in human history, knowledge could be preserved perfectly across generations without relying on memory. The accumulated wisdom of thousands of years could be recorded, studied, and built upon. Mathematics developed to support trade and astronomy, engineering to build irrigation systems, roads, and monuments, metallurgy to create bronze and later iron tools and weapons, ships capable of crossing oceans, wheeled vehicles for transport. All of this in just 10,000 years. A blink of an eye compared to the 250,000 years it took to get to behavioral modernity. But that's the power of cumulative culture. Once the foundation is in place, once you have reliable systems for transmitting knowledge across generations, innovation becomes exponential rather than linear. Each generation doesn't just inherit what came before, they build on it, add to it, improve it. The wheel leads to the cart, leads to the chariot, leads to the wagon. Writing leads to literature, leads to libraries, leads to universities. Bronze working leads to iron working, leads to steel making, leads to industrial manufacturing. And it all traces back to those crucial millennia around 50,000 years ago when behavioral modernity finally crystallized into a stable cultural package. When all the pieces that had been developing for hundreds of thousands of years finally came together and enabled humans to fully express their cognitive potential. So what really happened at 50,000? Not a sudden leap, not a genetic mutation, not divine intervention, just the final pieces of an incredibly complex puzzle clicking into place. The large populations that could sustain cumulative culture without losing knowledge when groups died out. The sophisticated language that could transmit abstract concepts reliably. The complex social structures that could coordinate large groups. The advanced tool technologies that enabled further innovation, the symbolic thinking that created shared beliefs binding communities together. All of these had been developing slowly, incrementally for hundreds of thousands of years, each building on what came before, each enabling further developments in other areas, creating a positive feedback loop that accelerated gradually until it reached critical mass and exploded into the full expression of human cultural potential. The paradox of behavioral modernity isn't really a paradox at all. It's just the natural progression of a species that had the hardware for complex culture from the beginning, but needed hundreds of thousands of years to develop the software to run on that hardware. Those early humans 300,000 years ago had brains capable of creating art, language, technology, and complex societies. But they lived in small, unstable populations facing constant environmental crises. They couldn't maintain the cultural systems needed to express that potential. Knowledge was gained and lost in cycles, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Over time, as populations grew more stable, as social systems became more complex, as communication became more sophisticated, the cultural foundation strengthened. By 100,000 years ago, the first signs of symbolic thinking appeared. By 70,000 years ago, art and ornamentation became more common. By 50,000 years ago, all the pieces came together and humans finally became what they'd always had the potential to be. And here we are today, 8 billion humans living on every continent. We've split the atom, mapped the genome, sent machines to other planets, connected the entire world with networks that would seem like magic to our ancestors 50,000 years ago. But we're the same species, the same brains, the same basic cognitive abilities. What's different is the accumulated knowledge we inherit, the cultural systems we're born into, the technologies we have access to, the collective wisdom of 250,000 years of human experience passed down through generations. You carry in your mind the legacy of every human who came before, the survival skills developed by those early populations fighting to stay alive in Africa, the social cooperation refined through tens of thousands of years of small group living, the language capabilities that took hundreds of thousands of years to fully develop. The innovative thinking selected for during countless crises and challenges. When you solve a problem, you're using cognitive abilities refined over 250,000 years. When you communicate with others, you're using language systems that took hundreds of thousands of years to develop. When you learn something new, you're participating in the same process of cultural transmission that made humans human. The story of Homo Sapiens is the story of potential slowly becoming reality, of hardware waiting for software, of a species that looked like us for 200,000 years before learning to act like us. And when that transformation finally happened, when all the pieces came together around 50,000 years ago, nothing could stop us. We became the most successful species in the history of life on Earth, not because we were stronger or faster or tougher than other animals, not because we had some magical quality that made us superior, but because we developed cumulative culture, the ability to pass knowledge reliably from one generation to the next, building on what came before, creating a ratchet effect where progress only goes in one direction. That's what really happened at 50,000, the culmination of 250,000 years of slow, steady development. The moment when human potential finally found full expression, the phase transition from anatomically modern humans to behaviorally modern humans. And it changed everything. Within 40,000 years, humans had spread across the planet, replaced every other human species, and begun reshaping the Earth itself. Within 50,000 years, we had invented agriculture and cities and writing. Within 60,000 years, we had created civilizations that would have seemed incomprehensible to our ancestors. All of it built on the foundation laid during those long millennia of gradual development. All of it made possible by the behavioral modernity that finally emerged around 50,000 years ago. All of it proof that sometimes the most important revolutions aren't sudden at all. They're the result of countless small changes accumulating over vast periods of time until they reach a tipping point and transform everything at once. That's the real story of what happened at 50,000. Not a mystery, not an unexplained leap, just the inevitable result of 250,000 years of human development finally reaching the critical threshold where potential became reality and changed our species forever. That's the real story of what happened at 50,000. Not a mystery, not an unexplained leap, just the inevitable result of 250,000 years of human development finally reaching the critical threshold where potential became reality and changed our species forever. But understanding this story changes how we think about ourselves. Because if behavioral modernity took 250,000 years to develop, if it required countless generations of slow cultural accumulation, then it's not something we should take for granted. It's not inevitable. It's not automatically self-sustaining. Every piece of knowledge you have, every skill you possess, every technology you use, it only exists because thousands of generations of humans before you learned it, refined it, and passed it on. Cultural knowledge doesn't survive automatically. It has to be taught, practiced, maintained across generations. This is something those early humans learned the hard way during those long millennia of apparent stagnation. When populations crashed, knowledge was lost. Techniques that took generations to develop disappeared when the people who knew them died. Groups had to start over, relearning basics their grandparents had mastered. The archaeological record shows this happening repeatedly. Sophisticated tool-making techniques appear at a site, persist for a few thousand years, then disappear, only to be reinvented thousands of years later, elsewhere. This isn't because humans forgot how to think, it's because the cultural transmission systems weren't stable enough to maintain knowledge through population crashes and environmental disasters. What changed by 50,000 years ago wasn't human intelligence. It was the reliability of cultural transmission. The systems for passing knowledge from one generation to the next became robust enough to survive even major disruptions. And once that happened, once cumulative culture became truly cumulative, the explosion was inevitable. Think about what this means for modern society. We live in an age of unprecedented knowledge accumulation. The internet gives us access to more information than all previous humans combined had access to. We can learn skills in hours that took our ancestors years to master. We can communicate instantly across the planet. We can solve problems by drawing on expertise from millions of people. But all of this depends on maintaining the cultural transmission systems that make it possible, education systems that pass knowledge to new generations, libraries and databases that preserve information, social institutions that maintain cooperation at massive scales, communication technologies that enable knowledge sharing. These systems aren't automatic. They require constant maintenance, constant investment, constant care. Let them decay and knowledge starts being lost. Let populations become too isolated and innovations stop spreading. Let cooperation break down and the cumulative culture that makes modern civilization possible begins to unravel. This isn't just theoretical, it's happened before in human history. The Bronze Age collapse around 3,200 years ago saw sophisticated civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean suddenly disintegrate. Writing systems were lost. Technologies disappeared, trade networks collapsed. It took centuries for those regions to recover the knowledge and capabilities they'd had. The fall of the Western Roman Empire led to centuries where technologies like concrete, aqueducts, and large-scale architectural techniques were lost in Europe. The knowledge existed, but the social and economic systems needed to maintain and transmit that knowledge had broken down. More recently, the collapse of classical Maya civilization saw the loss of mathematical and astronomical knowledge that took centuries to redevelop. Their sophisticated understanding of planetary cycles and eclipse prediction disappeared when the cultural systems maintaining that knowledge failed. These weren't failures of human intelligence, they were failures of cultural transmission systems. The knowledge existed in human minds and human records, but when the systems for passing that knowledge to new generations broke down, it was lost. This is the real lesson of the 250,000-year journey to behavioral modernity. Human potential is biological. It's been there from the beginning, encoded in our brains. But expressing that potential requires cultural systems that took hundreds of thousands of years to develop and that require constant maintenance to sustain. We are not automatically smarter or more capable than humans who lived 50,000 years ago. We have access to more accumulated knowledge. We inherit better cultural tools. We're born into social systems that enable capabilities our ancestors couldn't dream of. But take away those cultural systems and we'd be right back where they were. A modern human raised in complete isolation wouldn't invent writing or mathematics or agriculture. They'd have the potential for all of it, but they'd lack the cultural knowledge needed to express that potential. They'd be starting from scratch, just like those first anatomically modern humans 300,000 years ago. This is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminds us that our capabilities aren't just our own. They're gifts from thousands of generations who came before us, who learned and taught and struggled to pass knowledge forward. We stand on the shoulders of giants who lived in caves and never knew their contributions would lead to civilizations and space travel and the internet. But it's also empowering because it means human potential is essentially unlimited as long as we maintain the cultural systems that enable cumulative knowledge. Every generation can build on what came before. Every innovation creates opportunities for further innovations. The process that began accelerating 50,000 years ago hasn't stopped. If anything, it's accelerating faster now than ever before. The same feedback loops that drove the Great Leap Forward are still operating today. Better communication enables larger cooperative groups. Larger groups enable more specialization. More specialization enables faster innovation. Faster innovation solves problems that enable population growth and better communication. Round and round, each cycle faster than the last. The difference is scale. 50,000 years ago, the human population was maybe a few 100,000 spread across Africa, Asia, and Australia. Trade networks moved goods hundreds of miles. The largest cooperative groups numbered in the hundreds or low thousands. Innovation spread at the speed of human migration. Today, we're 8 billion people covering the globe. Trade networks move goods around the planet in days. The largest cooperative groups, like nations and international organizations, coordinate millions or billions of people. Innovation spreads at the speed of light through digital networks. The fundamental process is the same. Humans cooperating, communicating, accumulating knowledge, building on what came before. But the scale has increased by orders of magnitude, and with that increased scale comes increased capability. We can tackle problems that would have been inconceivable to our ancestors 50,000 years ago: global climate change, space exploration, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence. These aren't just technological challenges, they're civilizational challenges that require coordinating billions of people, trillions of dollars of resources, and knowledge spanning hundreds of scientific disciplines. But we can do it. We have the cognitive capabilities. We inherited them from ancestors who spent 250,000 years developing them. And we have the cultural systems. We inherited them from the populations who, 50,000 years ago, finally figured out how to make cumulative culture reliable and self-sustaining. What we need to remember is that none of this is automatic. The journey from anatomically modern humans to behaviorally modern humans took 200,000 years because it required developing cultural systems stable enough to maintain knowledge through disasters and disruptions. Those systems exist now, but they still require maintenance. Education systems need to be supported so new generations can inherit accumulated knowledge. Research institutions need to be funded so innovation can continue. Communication infrastructure needs to be maintained so knowledge can spread. Social institutions that enable cooperation at large scales need to be protected and improved. These aren't just practical concerns, they're existential necessities, because human success isn't guaranteed by our biology. It's enabled by our culture, and culture only persists as long as we actively maintain the systems that create and transmit it. The humans who lived through those long millennia before behavioral modernity fully emerged, they knew this instinctively. They understood that knowledge was precious, that it had to be guarded and passed on carefully or it would be lost. Every generation taught their children obsessively because losing knowledge meant death. We've become complacent because knowledge seems abundant. It's everywhere, freely available, easily accessed. But that abundance isn't natural. It's the result of massive cultural investments in systems for creating, preserving, and transmitting knowledge. Let those systems decay, and the abundance disappears faster than you'd think possible. This is perhaps the most important insight from understanding what really happened at 50,000. The Great Leap Forward wasn't a one-time event. It was the beginning of a process that requires constant active maintenance. Behavioral modernity isn't a fixed state we achieved and can now take for granted. It's a dynamic equilibrium that we have to continuously work to sustain. Every generation faces the choice: invest in maintaining and improving the cultural systems that enable human potential, or let them decay and watch capabilities slip away. teach the next generation carefully and thoroughly, or risk losing knowledge that took thousands of years to accumulate. Our ancestors, 50,000 years ago, made the right choice. They invested in teaching, in maintaining knowledge systems, in building social structures that could sustain cumulative culture, and their investment paid off beyond anything they could have imagined. Their small populations of thousands became billions. Their stone tools became spacecraft. Their cave paintings became the internet. We inherit that investment. We are the beneficiaries of 250,000 years of humans choosing to teach rather than hoard, to cooperate rather than compete, to maintain cultural knowledge rather than let it die with them. And now it's our turn. We get to choose whether to continue that investment or squander it. Whether to maintain the cultural systems that make modern civilization possible or let them decay. Whether to pass on our accumulated knowledge to the next generation or fail to teach them what thousands of generations struggled to learn. The story of what happened at 50,000 years ago is really the story of what happens when humans finally get the cultural systems right. When we develop reliable ways of accumulating and transmitting knowledge across generations. When we create social structures capable of coordinating large groups toward common goals. When we build communication systems that enable ideas to spread and combine and create new innovations. All of human achievement since then has been built on that foundation. Cities and agriculture and writing and mathematics and science and technology and art and music and everything else we think of as civilization. None of it would exist without the cultural systems that emerged around 50,000 years ago, and all of it could disappear if we fail to maintain those systems. Not because humans would become less intelligent, our brains would be exactly the same, but because intelligence without culture is potential without expression, hardware without software, capability without knowledge. The humans who lived 300,000 years ago had the same brains we do, the same cognitive potential. But they lived for 200,000 years without expressing that potential because they lacked the cultural systems needed to do so. We could easily find ourselves in the same situation if we're not careful. That's why understanding this story matters. It's not just interesting history, it's a roadmap for understanding who we are and how we got here. It's a warning about what we could lose if we're not careful. And it's an inspiration for what we might become if we continue investing in the cultural systems that make human achievement possible. Because the story isn't over. We're still in the middle of it, still building on what came before, still passing knowledge to the next generation, still cooperating in larger and larger groups to tackle bigger and bigger challenges. The great leap forward that began 50,000 years ago hasn't stopped. It's still accelerating. We're still discovering what humans are capable of when we have reliable cultural systems for accumulating and transmitting knowledge. We're still figuring out how far cumulative culture can take us. Maybe someday we'll spread beyond Earth carrying human culture to other worlds. Maybe we'll develop technologies we can't even imagine yet. Maybe we'll solve the existential challenges facing our civilization and build something even more remarkable. Or maybe we'll fail to maintain the cultural systems that make all of this possible, and future generations will have to start over, relearning what we forgot, rebuilding what we let decay. The choice is ours, just like it was the choice of our ancestors 50,000 years ago, and 100,000 years ago, and 200,000 years ago, going all the way back to the first anatomically modern humans in Africa 300,000 years ago. They chose to teach, to cooperate, to maintain knowledge systems even when survival was difficult, to invest in culture even when the immediate payoff wasn't obvious. And because of their choices, you exist. You have language and knowledge and capabilities they could only dream of. You are the fulfillment of their potential, the realization of 250,000 years of human development. Now it's your turn to choose. Will you maintain what you inherited? Will you pass it forward to the next generation? Will you continue the cultural transmission that makes us human? That's the real question raised by understanding what happened at 50,000 years ago. Not just what happened then, but what we're going to do now, how we're going to use the incredible gift of cumulative culture that thousands of generations struggled to create and pass on to us. The answer will determine whether the story of human potential continues to unfold in ways we can't yet imagine, or whether we become another cautionary tale of a species that had everything it needed to succeed but failed to maintain the cultural systems that made success possible. So when you learn something new, remember you're participating in a process that began hundreds of thousands of years ago. When you teach someone something, remember you're continuing a tradition that made humans human. When you cooperate with others, remember you're using capabilities refined over 250,000 years of evolution. You are not separate from the story of human development. You are the story. The latest chapter in a narrative that began with the first anatomically modern humans in Africa and continues with every person alive today. What happened at 50,000 wasn't the end of human evolution. It was the beginning of human history, the moment when we finally became capable of consciously shaping our own future rather than just reacting to environmental pressures. And the future we shape depends on whether we remember the lessons of those 250,000 years. That potential means nothing without the cultural systems to express it. That knowledge is precious and fragile and must be maintained. That cooperation and communication and teaching are not optional extras, but fundamental necessities for human success. Remember that, maintain that, and there's no limit to what we might achieve. Forget it, and we risk losing in a generation what took thousands of generations to build. That's the story of what really happened 50,000 years ago. And that's the challenge we face today.